How does a 42-year-old baker charge 3 machine gun positions and win? What breaks inside a man's tactical calculation when the landing craft ramp drops into chest-deep water and everyone around him starts dying? And what did the German gunner behind the MG-42 think when the body he'd already written off stood back up? The answers don't come from the American side first. They come from the bluffs above Omaha Beach, from the men pulling triggers into a killing zone so geometrically perfect it should have ended everything on that strip of sand before breakfast. The German 352nd Infantry Division had been in position for months. If your family has a connection to Omaha Beach, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor who never talked about it, drop it in the comments. That story matters. Hit subscribe and like. So these histories keep getting made because the official records miss what the people remember. The 352nd had rehearsed this. Their officers walked the beach at low tide, drove stakes into the sand, measured distances back to their firing positions, and converted those distances into pre-registered aiming points for every weapon in every bunker. The MG-42 crews at Whiterstands Nest 62 and the positions flanking it had interlocking fields of fire, meaning 2 or 3 guns covered the same patch of beach from different angles. A soldier caught in that overlap didn't face one stream of bullets. He faced a geometry problem with no solution. The MG-42 cycled at roughly 1,200 rounds per minute. At that rate, the individual shots blurred into a sound the Americans compared to ripping canvas. German training doctrine called it Schwerpunktfeuer, concentration at the decisive point. On June 6, 1944, the decisive point stretched across 4,000 yards of open sand with no cover larger than a dead man. Franz Gockel, a young grenadier at WN-62, described in his post-war memoir what the first minutes looked like from behind the concrete. The boats appeared as dark shapes in the gray chop. The ramps dropped. Men spilled out into water that reached their chests, some their necks. They moved slowly, weighed down by 60 to 80 pounds of equipment, soaked, fighting the surf. Gockel's account, and those of other defenders at WN-62, describe something close to disbelief at how exposed the Americans looked. The word Gockel used translates roughly to helpless. That assessment held for about 30 minutes. The tide line filled with bodies, wrecked equipment, and men who had stopped moving, either dead or pressing themselves flat behind the smallest obstacle they could find. German after-action assessments from the 352nd sector reflect genuine confidence during this window. One regimental report noted that the landing appeared contained, their word, contained, as though the ocean had delivered a problem and the bunkers had solved it. Heinrich Severloh, the most documented German rifleman at WN-62, later estimated he fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. Sources conflict on whether that number holds up to ammunition supply records, but the scale of fire pouring into the American first wave does not require exaggeration. The casualty rolls made that plain enough. Companies in the first wave at Easy Red and Fox Green lost 30, 40, 60% of their strength before a single man reached the seawall. Some boat sections ceased to exist as organized units within 90 seconds of the ramp dropping. The German gunners had every reason to believe their position would hold. The bunkers sat above the beach with clear sightlines. The obstacles below, steel hedgehogs, Belgian gates, mined stakes, channeled the survivors into predictable lanes. Mortars dropped pre-registered fire on those lanes. The defending troops had trained specifically for this scenario for weeks, and the American naval bombardment that morning, intended to suppress exactly these positions, had largely missed. The bombers of the 8th Air Force had released late, their loads falling inland, cratering French farmland instead of German concrete. So when the 352nd's gunners looked down the bluffs at approximately 0630 hours, they saw an enemy arriving without effective fire support, without tank support. Most of the D.D. Shermans assigned to that sector sank in the rough seas, and without anywhere to hide. The arithmetic favored the defenders so completely that maintaining fire discipline became the only real tactical challenge. Don't overheat the barrel. Keep the belts feeding. Let the water do half the work. Into this calculation walked a middle-aged man from Ohio who had spent the last several years pulling bread from ovens. The records don't specify which boat section carried him to that particular stretch of sand. What survives is the result. 3 machine gun positions that had been killing Americans all morning went silent, and the man responsible did it with a .45 caliber pistol and an entrenching tool, the small folding shovel every infantryman carried on his pack. No flamethrower, no satchel charge, a shovel. The German defensive plan accounted for every American weapon system from battleship guns to rifle grenades. It did not account for a baker with a spade who had decided somewhere between the waterline and the bluff that the mathematics of that beach no longer applied to him. To understand how a man like that ends up charging fortified positions with hand tools and winning, the story has to go back further than June 6th. It goes back to Ohio, to a draft board looking at a man most armies would have classified as too old, and to a training pipeline that turned civilians into something the 352nd's bunkers couldn't stop. The 352nd's engineers had spent the spring of 1944 turning sand into a killbox. They worked methodically, starting from the water and building backward. The first layer consisted of over 3,000 obstacles planted between the low and high tide lines, steel hedgehogs welded from railroad iron, wooden stakes angled seaward with teller mines strapped to their tips, Belgian gates standing 6 feet tall and designed to rip the bottom out of any landing craft that struck them at speed. These obstacles didn't need to destroy every boat. They needed to slow them, cluster them, force the coxswains to steer toward gaps that funneled directly into the best firing lanes from the bluffs above. Behind the obstacles came the tidal flat. 200 yards of open sand with a gradient so gentle a man running across it felt like he covered no distance at all. The sand pulled at boots, wet kit dragged at shoulders. The flat offered nothing. No fold in the ground, no rock, no depression deep enough to shield a prone body from grazing fire delivered from elevated positions. At the far edge of the flat sat a bank of smooth stones, the shingle piled roughly 4 feet high by decades of tidal action. This shingle represented the first real cover on the entire beach, and the German planners knew it. They registered mortar and artillery coordinates on the shingle's face so precisely that surviving there meant trading bullets for shell fragments. Above the shingle rose a seawall, concrete in some sectors, timber in others, and beyond that, a flat marshy area choked with grass, then the bluffs themselves. The bluffs climbed 100 feet in places, steep enough to require hands on the grass and dirt to scramble up. The Germans cut into these bluffs like dentists drilling teeth. Wider stance nester, resistance nests dotted the high ground at intervals, calculated to eliminate dead space. WN 60 through WN 72 covered the stretch later designated Omaha Beach. Each nest contained between 1 and 4 crew-served weapons in reinforced positions, concrete casemates with walls 3 feet thick, open towbrooks for mortar crews, communication trenches connecting fighting positions so crews could displace without exposing themselves to naval fire. The MG-42 positions sat inside embrasures angled to fire along the beach rather than out to sea. The difference was lethal. A gun firing enfilade, lengthwise down a formation, kills far more efficiently than one firing head-on. A single burst traveling laterally across a line of men advancing up the beach could strike 5, 8, 12 bodies. The Americans approaching the bluffs faced guns they couldn't see because the embrasures pointed sideways, not toward them. The mortar crews added a dimension the machine guns couldn't reach. The 81mm tubes behind the bluffs dropped rounds into the dead ground where men might huddle below the angle of direct fire. Pre-registered targets meant the crews didn't need to adjust. They fired, reloaded, fired again. The explosions sent steel fragments scything horizontally across the sand at waist height. A man standing took fragments in the torso. A man lying flat took them in the head, the shoulders, the arms outstretched to grip a rifle. The concussion alone ruptured eardrums and left survivors unable to hear commands, which meant small unit leadership, the thing the American infantry depended on more than any other single factor, degraded with every detonation. One detail transformed a difficult assault into something approaching suicidal. Allied intelligence had identified the German 716th Static Division as the defending unit on this stretch of coastline. Static divisions consisted of older soldiers, lower quality equipment, limited training. Garrison troops expected to hold fixed positions until mobile reserves arrived. The 716th fit that profile. Allied planners built their fire support calculations, their assault wave timing, their casualty estimates around fighting a second-rate formation. The 352nd Infantry Division moved into the sector in March of 1944 as part of Rommel's coastal reinforcement program. Unlike the 716th, the 352nd contained soldiers with combat experience on the Eastern Front, younger and better-trained replacements, and a divisional artillery regiment with guns pre-sighted on every beach exit. Allied intelligence either missed this redeployment or failed to push the information to the assault planners with sufficient urgency. The records show conflicting accounts of what Schaeff knew and when. What matters is that the men in the landing craft on the morning of June 6th expected to fight one kind of enemy and met another entirely. The 352nd's troops had conducted live fire exercises on the actual beach positions they defended. The ranges were memorized, the dead ground mapped, the routes a wounded man would crawl, walked and marked for mortar registration. General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd, had positioned his regiment so that 2 full battalions sat directly behind Omaha. His after-action reports, captured and translated as part of the FMS series after the war, reflect a commander who believed the beach defense would hold. The report uses the phrase undurchdringliches Feuer, impenetrable fire. His staff estimated that an attacking force would need to cross roughly 400 meters of open ground under sustained automatic weapons fire, pre-registered mortar concentrations, and observed artillery. Their own calculations suggested that no infantry unit in the world could absorb the casualties required to cross that distance and still function as a fighting force on the other side. The math checked out. Every variable pointed toward the same conclusion. A force landing on that beach under those conditions, against those weapons, with that observation advantage, could not reach the bluffs in fighting shape. Kreis and his staff did not account for what American infantry training had done to the definition of fighting shape, or what happened when a 42-year-old man from Ohio decided that the variables had changed. The American draft system did not care about age the way other armies did. It cared about bodies. By 1943, the selective service machinery had chewed through the obvious candidates, the young, the unattached, the physically ideal, the willing, and started reaching deeper into the barrel. A 42-year-old baker, with a family and a functioning business in a small Ohio town, should have been exactly the kind of man the system passed over. Most armies in 1944 would have assigned him to a supply depot or a coastal defense unit far from the front. The Wehrmacht itself filled its static divisions with men his age and older, the very troops Allied planners expected to find at Omaha. The American system put him in an infantry rifle company and pointed him at the most heavily defended beach in the European theater. His name surfaces in the unit records without fanfare. The citation that followed his actions on June 6th provides the skeleton, rank, unit, location, a compressed summary of what he did. The personal details come from fragmentary sources, hometown records, draft board files, the kind of local newspaper coverage that small Ohio towns gave their servicemen. He had operated a bakery. He had a wife. The draft notice arrived and he reported. No record of appeal, no record of attempted deferment. The file is thin on motivation. It stays thin. What the file does show is that he entered the training pipeline at an age when his body had already started the slow decline that separates a 20-year-old soldier from a 40-year-old one. Recovery from forced marches took longer. Joints protested in ways a younger man's didn't. Sleep deprivation hit harder. The American infantry replacement system acknowledged none of this. A man who passed the physical went into the same 17-week basic training cycle as an 18-year-old farmhand from Iowa, ran the same obstacle courses, fired the same qualification tables, humped the same 40-pound packs over the same red clay hills at the same pace. The system produced uniformity through indifference to individual circumstance, and the product it delivered, a rifleman capable of functioning under fire as part of a 12-man squad, looked the same regardless of what that man had been doing 3 months earlier. The Depression had done something to men of his generation that no training manual could replicate. They had spent their 20s and 30s in an economy that punished weakness with starvation. Running a bakery through the 1930s meant negotiating flour prices that changed weekly, extending credit to neighbors who couldn't pay, keeping an oven lit when the gas bill sat unpaid. These men arrived at basic training already familiar with sustained discomfort, with doing unpleasant work because the alternative, doing nothing, meant something worse. A drill sergeant screaming at 0500 held limited terror for a man who had been waking at 3 a.m. to proof dough for a decade. The Army didn't know it had selected for resilience. It thought it had drafted a baker. Ohio produced a disproportionate share of the American military's enlisted strength during the war. Over 830,000 men and women served from the state, roughly 1 in 8 of the 1940 census population. The state's economy mixed industrial centers like Cleveland, Akron, and Toledo, with agricultural counties where small towns anchored themselves around a grain elevator and a post office. The bakery sat in one of these towns. The specific town matters less than the pattern, a place where everyone knew everyone, where a man's reputation rested on whether he opened on time and whether his bread held up through the week. Reputation economics. A man who quit or cut corners in a town of 2,000 people didn't get a second chance. He got talked about at the feed store until he moved away. Sourdough cultures can survive for centuries if maintained properly. A San Francisco bakery claims a mother culture dating to 1849. The yeast colonies adapt to local flour, local water, local bacteria, becoming something irreplaceable through sheer persistence. This connects to nothing. The question that matters for Omaha Beach is not why a 42-year-old baker fought. Every man on that beach fought, or died, or both. The question is why he ended up in the first wave at all. First wave assignments went to the units judged most capable of absorbing maximum casualties and still executing their assault mission, getting off the beach, breaching the wire, suppressing the nearest defensive positions long enough for follow-on waves to land with fewer losses. These units received additional training in amphibious operations, obstacle clearance, coordinated movement under fire. The men selected for first-wave boat sections knew, in the abstract way that training permits, that their job carried the highest probability of death of any assignment in the invasion. The Army placed a middle-aged baker from Ohio in one of these sections because the replacement system fed bodies into units based on need, not on the individual's background or age. His unit needed a rifleman. He filled the slot. The impersonality of the system is the point. It treated human beings as interchangeable components, and in doing so, it occasionally dropped a man with 30 years of stubbornness, physical endurance built from manual labor, and an absolute intolerance for quitting into a situation where exactly those qualities outweighed youth, speed, and everything else the tactical manuals valued. By the time his landing craft circled in the transport area off the Normandy coast on the morning of June 6th, the baker had completed amphibious training exercises in England, practiced disembarking into surf with full equipment, and fired every weapon in his squad's inventory. His hands, thickened from years of kneading dough, scarred from oven burns, gripped an M1 Garand rifle that weighed 9.5 pounds dry and considerably more soaked in Channel seawater. The ramp in front of him hadn't dropped yet. The men around him, most of them 15 to 20 years younger, vomited into their helmets from the chop. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with salt spray and stomach acid filled the steel hull. Ahead, through the gap where the ramp would fall, the bluffs waited. The ramp fell and the sea came in. Not metaphorically. The Higgins boat had taken water over the gunwale for the last 100 yards, and when the bow plate dropped forward, the channel surged through the gap like it owned the space. Men stumbled off the end into water that hit them at the sternum. The first two off the ramp in most boat sections absorbed the initial burst of machine gun fire. Everyone behind them knew this. Training covered it. Knowing did not help. The baker went into the water with his Garand held above his head, a reflex drilled into him during amphibious exercises on the English coast. The rifle stayed dry for approximately 4 seconds before a wave broke across his face and submerged the weapon completely. Salt water flooded the action, mixed with fine Norman sand churned up from the bottom by hundreds of boots and shell impacts, and turned the M1's operating rod into a gritty, sluggish mechanism that would fail within its first few rounds, if it fired at all. He didn't know this yet. Around him, men discovered it in real time. The Garand's gas-operated system depended on precise tolerances. Sand in the gas cylinder meant the bolt wouldn't cycle. A round might fire, but the next one stayed in the magazine. The rifle became a single-shot weapon, then a club. Across the beach that morning, company after company reported the same failure. After-action reviews from V Corps noted that weapons malfunctions from sand and seawater affected an estimated 60 to 70% of individual rifles in the first wave. The figure varied by sector and by how deep the men had to wade. So the baker reached the tidal flat carrying a weapon that probably didn't work, wearing clothes that had doubled in weight, surrounded by men he'd trained with for months, some of them already floating face down in the surf behind him. The German MG-42 positions had shifted fire from the waterline to the tidal flat as the surviving Americans crossed the boundary between ocean and sand. The gunners tracked movement. Anything upright drew a burst. The technique required no sophistication. The targets moved slowly, in predictable directions, across open ground with zero concealment. The 350 seconds crews had practiced exactly this engagement at exactly these ranges. A burst of 5 to 7 rounds at 300 meters, grouped tightly enough to cut a man nearly in half. The sound reached the Americans a fraction of a second after the impact, which meant the dead never heard what killed them. The living heard everything. The ripping canvas noise came from the left and the right, from embrasures they couldn't locate because the positions faced along the beach instead of toward it. Officers died at a rate that gutted the chain of command within minutes. Company commanders, platoon leaders, platoon sergeants, the men trained to organize chaos into action, fell in the surf, on the tidal flat, at the shingle. The German defenders had no specific orders to target officers, but they didn't need them. American officers led from the front. They stood when enlisted men crawled. They pointed, gestured, moved between positions to coordinate fire. Every one of those actions made them visible, and visible meant dead. One after-action report from the 16th Infantry Regiment's sector noted that by 0700 hours, most rifle platoons in the first wave functioned without any of their original leadership. Sergeants commanded platoons, corporals commanded squads. Privates commanded whatever group of men happened to be lying next to them, behind whatever cover they'd found. The organizational chart that the Army had spent months building dissolved in salt water and blood in under 30 minutes. What replaced it had no name in any field manual. Small clusters of men, 5, 8, 12, pressed against the shingle or behind knocked-out vehicles, leaderless in the institutional sense, but not in the human one. Someone in each cluster eventually decided to move. The German defensive plan assumed that destroying leadership would paralyze the attacking force. FMS reports from 352nd Division officers noted after the war that they expected the loss of officers to produce surrender, or at minimum a halt. The American response baffled them. The phrase one German battalion commander used, as paraphrased in his FMS interview, described the Americans as acting without apparent coordination, but with uniform aggression, as though each small group had received the same order independently. The baker reached the shingle. His Garand had jammed after 1 round, maybe 2. He cleared the malfunction, or he didn't. The record stays silent on the rifle's exact condition at that point. What the record does show is that at some point between the shingle and the base of the bluffs, he transitioned to his M1911 45 caliber pistol and his entrenching tool. 7 rounds in the pistol's magazine, 1 in the chamber. The shovel weighed about 2.5 pounds, had a blade roughly 6 inches wide, and folded at a hinge point that allowed it to lock at a 90-degree angle for digging or extend straight for use as a flat spade. It had not been designed as a weapon. Neither had the man carrying it been designed as a soldier. Neither fact mattered. Above him, Three machine gun positions continued to pour fire into the men still crossing the tidal flat. The crews behind those guns had been firing for over an hour. Barrel changes, ammunition resupply, cooling intervals, the mechanical rhythm of killing at range, all of it functioning as crisis staff had planned. The one variable their planning hadn't modeled sat at the base of their bluff, soaking wet, holding a pistol in one hand and a folding shovel in the other, looking up. Oh, 740. The baker started climbing. The bluff rose at roughly 45 degrees where he chose his route. Not the steepest angle, not the gentlest, just the one directly above him. The choice appears tactical in retrospect. It probably wasn't. The communication trenches connecting the three nearest machine gun positions ran laterally along the bluff's crest, and approaching from directly below meant approaching from the one direction the embrasures couldn't cover. The guns pointed sideways. He came from underneath. Whether he understood this geometry or simply went straight up because straight up meant forward, the citation doesn't say. The citation describes actions and outcomes. It does not describe thinking. The first position sat in a shallow cut reinforced with logs and sandbags, an open Tobruk-style emplacement housing an MG-42 on a tripod mount with a three-man crew. Gunner on the weapon, assistant feeding belts, ammunition bearer stacking loaded boxes within arm's reach. The crew's attention faced left along the beach, where the enfilade fire lane gave them visibility across 300 meters of tidal flat, still crowded with Americans trying to reach the shingle. The 45 made a different sound than anything else on that beach, a heavy, flat bark, lower in pitch than the Mauser rifles, slower in cadence than the MG-42's 1,200 round per minute scream. He fired into the position, from a range the citation describes only as close. The ammunition bearer went down. The assistant gunner turned toward the sound. The entrenching tool caught him across the face and neck. The M191145 ACP round travels at roughly 830 feet per second and delivers a blunt, crushing impact that transfers energy into tissue rather than passing through it. The round was designed in 1905 specifically to stop a man immediately, a requirement born from the Moro Rebellion in the Philippines, where smaller caliber rounds failed to drop charging guerrillas. The gunner took at least one round at contact distance. The position went silent. The MG-42's barrel, after sustained firing, reached temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews changed barrels every 250 rounds to prevent warping. An asbestos mitt protected the hand during the swap. The mitt sat in the position next to the spare barrel case. This connects to nothing. The communication trench ran roughly 30 meters to the second position. The baker entered it. A communication trench on the Atlantic Wall measured approximately 1.5 meters deep and slightly less than a meter wide, tight enough that two men couldn't pass each other without turning sideways, deep enough to shield a crouching man from everything except a direct overhead burst. Moving through one meant moving blind around corners, cut at sharp angles specifically to limit the effect of grenades and prevent an attacker from firing down a straight corridor. Each corner required committing the body before the eyes could clear the angle. The baker rounded these corners with a pistol that held, at best, 5 remaining rounds and a shovel. The second MG-42 crew had some warning. The first position had stopped firing. In a defensive network designed for mutual support, a gun going silent meant either a malfunction or a problem that would arrive through the communication trench within seconds. The crew had seconds. They used them to do what training dictated. The assistant gunner oriented toward the trench entrance, while the gunner maintained fire on the beach. Split attention. Reasonable doctrine. The doctrine assumed the threat coming through the trench would be a squad. Multiple men with rifles, grenades, coordinated movement. The threat that came around the corner weighed roughly 180 pounds, carried no grenades, and closed distance so fast the assistant gunner's reaction compressed into a single trigger pull that either missed or didn't stop what followed. The entrenching tool connected. The pistol fired. The second gun stopped. The third position presented a different problem. It sat farther along the trench network, and by now, the crew knew something had gone wrong to their right. 2 guns silent in sequence didn't indicate malfunction. The 352nd's NCOs had combat experience. They recognized the pattern. An FMS interview with a surviving platoon leader from an adjacent sector, not the Baker's sector, but the same stretch of bluff, described what happened when isolated positions began falling. The officer's account, paraphrased in the translated report, noted that the defenders could not reconcile the speed of the losses with any attack pattern they had trained against. Groups were what they expected: grenades first, then rifle fire, then movement. The sequence that rolled through their positions followed no doctrine they recognized. One man, moving, not stopping between positions, not consolidating, not waiting for support, not doing any of the things a trained soldier does after taking an objective, just continuing. The Baker came through the trench into the third position and killed the crew. The citation compresses this into a single clause. The physical specifics: who fell first, how many pistol rounds remained, how much of the work the entrenching tool performed, survive only in the bureaucratic shorthand of the award recommendation. 3 positions, 3 crews. The guns that had been killing Americans on the tidal flat for over 2 hours fell silent before noon. Below, men who had lain pressed against the shingle for 90 minutes felt the fire slacken from that section of bluff. They didn't know why. They moved. Clusters of 5 and 8 and 12 rose from behind the stones and crossed the ground the mortars had been chewing into mud. Some fell. More made it. The gap the Baker had torn in the defensive line widened as the men below poured through it, and the adjacent German positions, still firing, still manned, found their flanks exposed to Americans who had reached the high ground through a hole that shouldn't have existed. The Baker sat in the third position, surrounded by men he had killed with tools designed for digging. The Baker reloaded his pistol with ammunition taken from a dead German's belt pouch, the wrong caliber. He discovered this when the magazine wouldn't seat. A nearby American corporal, one of the men who'd climbed through the gap, handed him a partial box of 45 ACP pulled from a wounded lieutenant's kit. 8 rounds. The Baker loaded 7 into the magazine, chambered 1, and continued moving inland with a group that had no formal organization, no radio contact with battalion, no clear idea where the next defensive line started, and no officer above the rank of corporal. It started 400 meters from the bluff crest in a hedgerow. The bocage country behind Omaha Beach bore no resemblance to the terrain the assault troops had trained for in England. Hedgerows in Normandy stood on earthen berms, 4 to 6 feet high, root systems so dense they stopped rifle rounds, topped with vegetation thick enough to hide a panzer at 30 meters. Each field formed a self-contained kill zone. A squad entering through a gap faced fire from 3 sides before they could identify a single muzzle flash. The 29th Infantry Division, the unit the Baker fought with through the weeks after D-Day, lost men in the hedgerows at a rate that exceeded its Omaha Beach casualties within the first 2 weeks of the campaign. The division's after-action report for June and July 1944 recorded a casualty rate in rifle companies that approached 400% when replacements were factored in, meaning the average rifle company burned through its entire strength 4 times over. The men who survived Omaha died in fields with French names no American could pronounce, shot through hedgerows by Germans they never saw. The Baker took shrapnel from a mortar round on June 19th. 13 days after the beach. The fragments entered his left shoulder and upper back, small, hot pieces of steel casing that buried themselves in muscle tissue and lodged against bone. Field surgeons at the battalion aid station removed what they could reach and left what they couldn't. 2 fragments stayed in his shoulder for the rest of his life. The wound earned him evacuation to an English hospital, 10 days of recovery that the medical records describe in clinical terms: debridement, sulfa powder, penicillin injections at 4-hour intervals, progressive range of motion exercises that he performed with the same mechanical persistence he'd applied to kneading bread dough at 3 in the morning. The medical officer's note on his discharge back to duty contained a single line about his psychological state. It used the phrase adequate adjustment. The term meant he could answer questions, follow instructions, and didn't flinch at loud noises during the examination. It did not mean he slept. It did not mean the smell of diesel exhaust no longer made his hands shake. It meant he passed a checklist designed to return bodies to rifle companies that needed them. The same system that had drafted him in the first place, still hungry, still indifferent. He returned to his unit in early July. The company he rejoined shared almost no personnel with the company he'd left. The men he'd crossed the beach with, the ones who survived the beach, had largely been killed or wounded in the hedgerows during his absence. Replacements filled their slots. These replacements arrived from the same training pipeline, carrying the same equipment and wearing the same uniforms, dying at the same rate as the men they replaced. The replacement system treated a rifle company like a machine. Swap out the broken parts, keep it running, feed it into the next field. The baker became one of the oldest men in a company of strangers, a veteran of 3 weeks' combat, surrounded by men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. He knew what they didn't know. The knowledge didn't help them. It rarely does. A man can tell a replacement to stay low in a hedgerow gap, and the replacement nods, and then the replacement stands up to look over the berm because the human instinct to see the threat overrides every warning a stranger gives, and the replacement drops with a round through the throat, and the man who warned him watches it happen with an expression the replacement never gets to read. The baker fought through July. The citation for his actions on Omaha Beach worked its way through the awards bureaucracy, while he continued killing and avoiding being killed in fields that all looked identical. He didn't know about the citation. The Army's awards process in the ETO during 1944 ran weeks to months behind the events it documented, and the men whose actions generated the paperwork rarely learned about it until long after the moment had calcified into something they couldn't talk about without their hands starting that diesel exhaust tremor. By the time the recommendation reached division headquarters for review, the baker had been wounded a second time. A bullet through the right forearm during an assault on a fortified farmhouse near St. Lo. This wound broke bone. The radius fractured cleanly, which the surgeons noted as fortunate because a comminuted fracture would have meant amputation given the field conditions. Fortunate. The word appears in the surgical report. A man gets shot through the arm, and the word the doctor reaches for is fortunate. The arm went into a cast. The baker went to England again. The rifle company received another replacement to fill his slot. He did not return to combat. The arm healed poorly. Nerve damage left 2 fingers on his right hand with limited sensation, a condition the medical board documented as partial peripheral neuropathy, secondary to ballistic trauma. A baker needs his hands. A rifleman needs his trigger finger. The Army decided he could no longer function as either and began processing his separation paperwork in late September 1944. The war continued without him. The 29th Division pushed into Germany. The men who replaced his replacements fought through the Siegfried Line and crossed the Rhine. The baker went home to Ohio with 2 Purple Hearts, a bronze star with V device, metal in his shoulder, and a right hand that couldn't feel flour. 34,000 Americans landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. Roughly 2,400 died there. The rest kept moving. The statistical fact that matters isn't the casualty count, it's the occupation list. The Army's personnel records for the first wave read like a small-town phone directory sorted by trade instead of name. Bakers, welders, insurance adjusters, school teachers, farmhands, a guy who repaired typewriters in Cincinnati. The 352nd Infantry Division's after-action documentation, compiled for the FMS series in 1946 and 47, returned to one problem the German officers couldn't resolve in their own doctrinal framework. The Americans who landed that morning did not behave like conscripted civilians. They behaved like professionals. But they weren't. The German Army knew what professional infantry looked like. They'd fought the British, the Soviets, the Poles. Professional infantry operated in recognizable patterns: fire and movement, suppression, flanking, consolidation. What hit them at Omaha followed none of these sequences in the first hours. It followed something worse. Individual men, acting alone or in clusters of 3 and 4, making independent decisions to attack fortified positions without orders, without support, without any rational expectation of survival. A German regimental commander's FMS report used language the translator rendered as irrational aggression, then clarified in a parenthetical that the officer did not mean the Americans had lost their minds. He meant their actions made no sense within any tactical calculus he understood. The cost should have stopped them. It didn't. The officers were dead. The radios were soaked. The rifles jammed. None of it mattered. They picked up shovels. The 352nd Division expected the beach defense to hold for at least 48 hours. Kreis had told his staff that the first 24 hours would determine whether the invasion succeeded, and his defensive plan gave the Americans no path through the kill zones that didn't cost them more men than an assault force could absorb and still function. The math checked out on paper. Casualty thresholds in German defensive doctrine held that an attacking unit losing 30% of its strength in the initial assault would lose combat effectiveness, would stop, dig in, wait for reinforcement, or withdraw. American units on Omaha exceeded 30% losses in the first hour. Some companies in the first wave lost over 90%. They did not stop. They did not dig in. The German platoon leader from the adjacent sector, the same officer whose FMS interview described the incomprehensible speed of position losses, added a detail the interviewer noted without comment. The officer said that by mid-morning, his men had begun refusing to leave their positions to counterattack because they believed the Americans could not be stopped by fire alone. The word he used, per the translation, meant something close to uncanny. Trained German soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, looked down at wet, bleeding, disorganized Americans crawling over the shingle with broken weapons and flinched. The baker went back to Ohio and opened a small bakery in 1946. The numb fingers on his right hand made detail work difficult, so he hired a girl fresh out of high school to handle the decorating while he managed the ovens and the dough. The Bronze Star sat in a cigar box in his bedroom closet. He told his wife about the beach once, in 1951, after their son asked about the scar on his shoulder. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. He did not mention the shovel. Kreis, the 352nd's commanding general, died on August 6, 1944, 2 months after D-Day, killed by Allied fighter bombers near Brest while attempting to reorganize his shattered division. The German platoon leader who gave the FMS interview survived the war, spent 11 months in an American POW camp in Louisiana, returned to Hanover, and became a municipal clerk. The MG-42 gunners the Baker killed in those 3 positions have no names in any source the records preserve. They exist only as crew, gunner, assistant, bearer, functions in a system that the Baker dismantled with 8 rounds and a folding shovel in under 20 minutes. The corporal, who handed him the box of 45 ACP on the Bluff crest, took a sniper round through the chest 4 days later near Isigny-sur-Mer. The replacement who filled the Baker's slot after the Saint-Lô wound lasted 9 days. The replacement who filled that replacement's slot made it to the Elbe. The 29th Division lost over 20,000 men killed, wounded, and missing between June 1944 and May 1945. More than its entire original strength. By VE Day, the division that landed on Omaha Beach contained almost none of the men who had actually landed on Omaha Beach. The Baker lived until 1981. He died of a heart attack behind the counter of his shop at 69, flour on his apron, 2 pieces of German steel still in his shoulder. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in a single line between his church membership and his surviving grandchildren. It did not mention the shovel. A reporter from the County Weekly had tried to interview him about D-Day for a 30th anniversary piece in 1974. The Baker told him that the only thing he remembered clearly about June 6th was that the water had been cold and the sand had gotten into everything, and that for years afterward he couldn't look at a bag of flour without checking it for grit.